to this particular issue. He's great. We're going to dialogue with him today on Mary and the fathers in the Syriac church. Dr. Sebastian Brock, how are you doing today?
Well, very good to hear you.
Yeah, how's the weather over there for you?
It's cool but sunny, and we had rain this morning.
You had rain. Okay, so it's good. It's pretty nice weather then.
Not too bad.
Very, very good. Very good. Yeah. So today we have a very interesting topic. I'd like to start it off right away by asking you, Dr. Brock, in your opinion, what makes the Syriac fathers so unique?
I suspect that the basic reason is that Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, and Aramaic was, of course, the language of Jesus. And this is something they're very proud of. And I think it really does make a difference, because Christianity went west in Greek and Latin and east in Syriac. And so although Syriac Christianity is heavily dependent and in contact with the Greek world, they do have a certain amount that's particular to themselves. And I think this link through the language is very important, because it means they're closer in many ways to their Jewish roots, to the Jewish roots of Christianity. And that comes out in quite a number of things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Dr. Brock. I think that when we look at the Syriac fathers, their unique kind of methodology of the way they transmit the message, it's so incredible, it's so amazing. A lot of their language is very poetic, but at the same time as being very poetic, it is filled with an incredible amount of theology that is so rich and so faithful to the history of the church. And that's why, as for people that may not know, Dr. Sebastian Brock is my friend. Whenever I have anything pressing on my mind when it comes to Saint Ephrem or Jacob or any other incredible figure, I reach out to him, we dialogue, and we talk about it. And he is an incredible mind. For anybody tuning into the show right now that may not have heard of his work, go to Amazon or go anywhere and look up his books. If you don't own them already, you should own them. And what I think is going to be the very special thing about today's show, Reason and Theology, is we're going to get to talk about Ephrem. We're going to get to talk about a lot of really important topics. And you can be really sure that when we have the great Sebastian Brock on, we will be dealing with real quotes and not fake quotes that are just picked up off the internet. And, you know, this is a real deal. This is real stuff, not just stuff copied and pasted that really is not even a real quote from Ephrem. So, Dr. Brock, I would like to ask you, because we've dialogued about this before and it's fascinating to me. And I'll ask you this question, and after that, I want to hop on over to Daniel so he can pick your brain a little bit. Do the Syriac fathers speak of the Virgin Mary perhaps in a unique way that other fathers don't, or in a manner consistent with the other fathers? What I mean is the incredibly beautiful language used for Mary. Is it unique to them?
Probably not unique, but as it were, the proportion is higher than. You will find a lot of things very similar hidden away in Greek liturgical poetry, Latin liturgical poetry, but it's so profuse in Syriac. And a thing that is very unusual in Syriac is that real theology is done, especially by St. Ephrem, in not in prose as one expects in the West, but in poetry. And Ephrem's theology, which is actually very profound, he never states everything at once, but if you read all his poems, you'll find that there is a very well thought out substructure to his sort of worldview, how he relates the material world to the spiritual world, this world and next world, and so on. And it's in poetry he does this and not in his prose works. And that is something which I suppose is unique to Syriac, but it's also unique within Syriac to Ephrem.
Incredible.
And on Mary, it's difficult to say there's anything unique. The things that are perhaps distinctive, there are certain exegetical features and typologies, one or two, which I've only found extremely rarely in the Greek literature, but I'm not all that well read in the Greek fathers. But this particular one I'm thinking of is based on Genesis 22, and this is the sacrifice of Isaac. And in the Peshitta, or rather in Ephrem's commentary on the Peshitta, the Syriac translation, there is a rather intriguing statement that he says that because Isaac asked the question on the way up to the mountain, where is the lamb for the slaughter? That means, in Ephrem's concept, that the ram must have been provided miraculously. So it's and the ram is on the tree, and Ephrem says also the tree was a miraculous appearance, because Isaac had asked about Isaac had carried wood, and that meant that there wasn't any wood there beforehand. So these things appeared suddenly. And Ephrem doesn't use this typologically himself, but in the later tradition, it's used as a type of the virgin birth. And that probably is pretty well confined to Syriac writers, because it doesn't work in the Greek exegetical tradition. Wow. I have actually found it in Romanos, the 6th century Greek poet, that Romanos may well have got it from Syriac fathers. Romanos came from Syria.
That is amazing, Dr. Brock. That is something that I confess I was not aware of. I'm sure Daniel and Elijah are probably aware of that, but that is amazing. That to me shows me at least that perhaps there was a strand of an ancient tradition that was carried on, perhaps, I guess, in the Syriac tradition, preserved in the great Saint Ephrem. That is amazing. And before I hop this over to Daniel, I do want to ask you one last question, and we'll do a little bit of a round table before we get back to me. Ephrem, as you know very well, because I've gotten it from your incredible book, Ephrem interprets Mary as the woman that tramples the head of the serpent in Genesis 3. I wonder, I am very well aware of the Greek and the Latin fathers that do that as well. But I said, you know what? I've got to pick Dr. Brock's brain. Are there any other Syriac fathers that give such an interpretation?
I suspect there are. Offhand, I can't answer that. But if you look in the liturgical texts, everyone later than Ephrem is often strongly dependent on Ephrem. And that applies especially in the liturgical tradition. When you sent me the question this morning, I thought I'd better look up the text, and it's quite interesting. In the Genesis, as is in the normal translation, is God is speaking to the serpent, and he says to her seed, that's Eve's seed, will trample on the serpent's head, and you will strike it by the heel. In fact, the Hebrew and most English translations have the same verb, trample and strike. I think in the RSV it's bruise. Now, in what has happened in Ephrem's passage, this is in the Hymns of the Nativity, he's introduced Psalm 74, verse 14. That'll be 73 in the Septuagint. You have crushed the head of Leviathan. Well, Leviathan, of course, is Satan. but it's the verb crush, and this is a very strong verb, and that is introduced by Ephrem into the hymns on nativity, and he has this one hymn which you started off from, where it's the foot of Mary which tramples on Satan, but elsewhere Ephrem, again in the hymns on the nativity, has the blessed child, i.e. Christ, crushing the head. So that's introducing the psalm passage, whereas where he's speaking of Mary, he uses a different verb, which is more the verb that's used in Genesis. So it's only when, it's rather complicated, this, but it's when Christ, which is the normal interpretation, as the person who crushes the head of the serpent, and that's when Ephrem introduces the verb from the Psalms. Whereas when it's Mary who's trampling, it's simply on the basis of Genesis.
Wow, that to me is amazing, Dr. Brock. That shows that Ephrem was very familiar with the classic Genesis 3 interpretation.
He certainly was. And Ephrem knew the biblical text fantastically well.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah, I want to toss the ball over to Daniel, who does want to pick your brain a little bit. Daniel, for the audience, is our Oriental Orthodox representative, and he's got quite a brain in him. Daniel, would you like to talk to Dr. Brock?
Sure. Thanks, William. Thank you again, Malfono, for being here with us. I just wanted to ask you about the way Ephrem and Jacob thought about the robe of glory regarding Mary. And so in the poems, the hymns on the Nativity, and in the commentary on the Diatessaron, Ephrem he talks about how she received it at the Annunciation. And then we know that he says that both of the poets and in the Syriac tradition in general, about how Christ left the robe of glory for us in the water so that we can put it back on again. So I wanted to ask you what that means and what does it imply regarding the robe of glory, and is it unique to the Syriac tradition, this way of speaking?
Yes, thank you. Yes, this goes back behind Ephrem, and the origin is actually, as often is the case, in Judaism, and a particular interpretation of the garments which Adam and Eve were clothed in. Now, in the standard Hebrew and all the translations, it's garments of skin. But by a very easy change, which sounds very much the same in Hebrew, they could be garments of light. Now, you can understand the syntax of that particular verse in two different ways. Most people understand it, and that's the standard way, that it's the consequence of the disobedience. But there was a Jewish tradition which associated with a particular Rabbi Meir, which understood it as the state of Adam and Eve before the fall. And then that's a possible interpretation of the Hebrew. Hebrew verbs are quite difficult to translate, getting the time right, as it were. Now, that is picked up in early Syriac Christianity and becomes, as it were, a key term that's used, or the phrase, the robe of light, the robe of glory. You get both phrases very frequently, as a term which provides the whole of salvation history. It travels all the way through salvation history. So Adam and Eve originally clothed in the garment of glory or of light, and that's the Jewish tradition. And then they lose it at the fall, the disobedience of God's commandment. And then the whole aim of God is to reclothe humanity in that robe of glory or robe of light. And the other sort of great gift given to humanity by God is free will. So this is not an easy task, given the rebelliousness of human beings. And first of all, then this is now we get to Ephrem. He speaks of God putting, or the divine word, putting on language, in fact, putting on words, as it were. And that is the allowing himself to be spoken of in human language. And Ephrem is very keen on the transcendence of God and the huge gap between God and creation. And only God can transcend or can cross over that gap. And so it has to be God's initiative. And so, first of all, God puts on human language, allows himself to be spoken of in human terms, and then speaks through the prophets and so on. And then finally, he puts on the body. So it's all this clothing imagery of putting on, taking off. It's something that's very characteristic of Syriac, though it's not confined to Syriac. And the standard early understanding of the Greek term esarkothe, he became incarnate in the creed. That is, he put on the body in Syriac, and that's Ephrem's standard term too. And then, as you mentioned, it's Christ deposits this in the River Jordan, ready for individual Christians to put it on in potential at baptism, and then if they retain this robe clean, in a state of purity, then it's put on in reality at the eschaton, in the next world. Now, how does Mary fit in with all this? Ephrem has a number of poems where he's speaking about Mary and her experience, and at one point he asks how he should call Mary, and he gives a whole number of things. Is she mother? Is she daughter? Is she sister? And so on. And eventually, he, at least I think, I forget if he states this outright, but in order to understand what he's saying, you have to understand that Ephrem sees Mary as having been baptized by the presence of Christ in her womb. And it's the baptism aspect that means that she has put on this robe of glory in reality already in this life, and this serves as her baptism. And so that's why Mary already in this life is assured of the robe of glory. And in many ways, Mary is seen by Ephrem and indeed all the Syriac fathers as a paradigm for what should be the case, or ideally would be the case, with every Christian. So it's quite a mouthful, I'm afraid.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to see if Elijah has any questions for you.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Clearly.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Doctor, for being on. Daniel, Sub-Deacon Daniel, and I have been talking about the Syriac fathers in relation to Mariology for the past, I would say, like 5 years, maybe more. And William and I have been for the past year or so, and so we're really interested in this topic. Really excited to have you. And one question that always comes up is the question of the Roman Catholic dogma of Immaculate Conception. And I know this is probably really anachronistic of us to ask, and my question isn't so much did Ephrem believe in the Immaculate Conception, but my question is if the Roman Catholic dogma of the Immaculate Conception is simply saying that at no point in Mary's life did the dominion of the devil ever touch her. Like she was completely pure at every point of her existence. Would you say that Ephrem believed this throughout her whole existence, or would he have believed it up starting at the Annunciation, where she put on the robe of glory?
No, I think, and it's the other way put these in completely different terms, and certainly, or I would say probably not with some of the implications of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And what Ephrem, and indeed this is found in all the Syriac fathers, understand is that Mary was the most suitable, the most holy, most pure of all human beings, I suppose, at that point in time, and maybe at all points in time. And so from that point of view, she is immaculate, and they don't use that term, at least not in the way that it's used theologically. So in some ways you could say it's very similar, but it's not quite the same.
Sure. Absolutely. What does he mean, and by he I mean Saint Ephrem, when he talks about baptism of water and blood with relation to Mary? Is this a baptism of sins? Like, are there any sins that is being washed away from her, or did he also believe that she had an inclination to sin, concupiscence or any evil passions or things of that sort?
I don't think he ever really discusses that. I mean, I don't really know what he would say. I guess he wouldn't be particularly concerned with, as it were, remission of sins at baptism.
I see. Okay.
And I think one can understand what's happening at baptism in so many different ways, and that's certainly not an emphasis that Ephrem, or indeed many of the Syriac fathers, give. And this is certainly present in the catechetical literature, but in a way, it's not so much. It is a movement into new life, and this, I suppose, is brought out in the imagery that's used, maybe in the sort of more Johannine view of baptism, that it's a rebirth rather than a death and resurrection, as in Paul. And the Pauline imagery is so familiar, especially in the West, that one rather forgets the Johannine imagery of rebirth. And it's the rebirthing that is the really prominent aspect, certainly in the early Syriac tradition. And you have both elements, Paul and John, are present, but that's the predominant emphasis, and I'd say this is the case in Ephrem and also in a lot of the liturgical poetry on dealing with baptism. So then, as it were, the focus is elsewhere. It's not particularly on sin.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Doctor. I'll pass it on to William. He has a couple questions that both Daniel and I are really curious about as well.
Dr. Brock, thank you for that interaction. And I remember when I was dialoguing with Dr. Brock, maybe a year and a half ago, when I was a bit confounded before I had done a good amount of research on when the fathers talk about the baptism of Mary. And I remember I tossed that your way and you told me, no, William, it's not talking about a baptism of sin. And I'm glad that we finally got that on the air, because it's been such a joy picking your brain, Doctor. You are the foremost scholar when it comes to
well,
these matters.
Did about that.
Yeah, you are. You're quite too humble there. You really are. And there is one question. I remember talking to you about it maybe about a year and a half back when we first began dialoguing, and it has always really, really interested me. And I kind of want to pick your brain a little bit more on it, and I'm sure the audience will get a lot out of it as well. There's a particular piece in Ephrem which you usually find it only translated in portion, which I find very odd. Usually you find it amongst Lutheran translators or Catholic ones. And I remember when I first reached out to you, it was because I couldn't find it in English. I believe it was a Nizabene hymn 27 or 28, I think, where Ephrem says that there is no spot in Mary, making the analogy of that of Christ. And I am just curious, what I think you kind of already went over a little bit, but when Ephrem says that there is no spot in Mary, no stain in Mary, can we at least, and I know you differ a little bit when it comes to the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, even though you say sometimes the language can be, reconciled in various areas. At that particular point in time, when Ephrem says that about Mary, what does he mean when he says that there is no spot or stain within Mary? What is the exact meaning there?
Well, with that passage at hand, and I haven't got it at hand, it's a bit difficult to say. But one has to think what point in Mary's life, as it were, is Ephrem talking about? And if he's talking about the moment of the Annunciation, then there's no problem at all. If it's talking about her birth, then that would, of course, be much closer to the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, but I guess that's not terribly likely. So the whole question hangs on what is in Ephrem's mind, and that I don't know, partly because I haven't got the text in front of me, but almost certainly the text wouldn't help all that much. But
now, I wonder, I'm sorry for interrupting there, Doctor. I wonder, do you think it was possible that the idea, and let's maybe eliminate the whole terminology of the technical jargon found within the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and let's break it down and say, do you think it's possible Ephrem believed that Mary was preserved from every stain of sin from the very moment of her existence? Do you think that's possible to be gleaned from his writings?
I don't think he thought in this sort of way. I think this is, that sort of question seems to me a very typical question of Western post-scholastic approach to the subject of Mariology.
Okay, so you don't think that he would have thought?
Well, he certainly wouldn't have.
You know, he would have thought in dogmatic ways.
No, Ephrem doesn't like fixed statements,
right?
Because they're fossilizing. So his the image that I use of how Ephrem theologizes, as it were, is think of a circle and a point in the center. The point in the center is the sort of thing that scholastic theology goes in for. It tries to define things. Ephrem is not interested in the center. In fact, he says that you shouldn't examine the center because that's the that's the truth of God, as it were. And what he does is he takes points around the circumference and uses these as paradoxes. And so he has a whole set of paradoxes, and you think of these going around the circle of the circumference of the circle, and if you join up all the opposite lines, you will find that they will cross at exactly the same point in the center. So Ephrem is saying that these paradoxes don't contradict each other, but they spark off some sort of understanding of what the divine reality is. So he's simply, he's actually quite strong that in his language he dislikes dogmatic statements simply because he says these are things that you're examining aspects of the deity which are beyond the human intellect. And the reason he's so strong against this is because the Arians at his time were very strong force in Christian tradition in the area, and they had a conception of the begetting of the Son, which is quite different from Ephrem's, and according to them, it allowed them to investigate the Son, the generation of the Son, in a way that Ephrem thought was totally illicit, because it was beyond the chasm between humanity and creation.
That's fascinating, Doctor. I appreciate that answer. In your book, where you talk about various Marian hymns, you say something that really stuck out to me, and really, I even now I think it's incredible. It says, Saint Ephrem and the other Syriac writers represented here in this book lies in the way they show how complex is Mary's relationship with her Son. She is sister, bride, handmaid, and daughter, as well as his mother, and likewise how intricate is the web of interconnections between Mary and the Old Testament, between Mary and the Church, and between Mary and the Christian believer. I wonder, Dr. Brock, I'm curious, are there any other Syriac writers such as Jacob or even in Ephrem, where they find Mary anywhere else in the Old Testament, any kind of imagery used of Mary in the Old Testament? That is a question that I find fascinating. I'm sure the audience would be fascinated as well. Is there any other connection that they make to Mary in the Old Testament writings outside of Genesis, that would be?
Oh, yes. In fact, you'll find if you read, in any early liturgical texts, whether Greek, Syriac, or whatever, you'll find a huge number of references which are seen in the Old Testament, which are seen as types of Mary. Perhaps the most familiar is the burning bush, which the burning bush is Mary, the fire is Christ in her womb, and the burning bush is not burnt, and Mary is not sort of burnt up by the otherness of the fire of the presence of the divine word in her womb. But there are many, many types of Mary in the Old Testament. Another one that's very common is the swift cloud that's in Isaiah somewhere. Now, this actually only works with the Septuagint, because in the Syriac biblical translation, it's swift clouds. And so in Syriac, the swift clouds are the apostles. So it depends on which version, which biblical text you're using, that sometimes these things work and sometimes they don't. And there are, as I say, a large number of these types in the Old Testament. Another very common one is the door in Ezekiel, through which no one passes except at the end of time, or I forget how it is in Ezekiel, but anyhow, no human being passes through it, and of course the one who does is the divine word. And these things are alluded to all over the place in liturgical poetry, and if you don't know your biblical text well, they're often very puzzling. What on earth some grass doing here? And there's something in the Psalms about grass from the earth or something. I forget what it is. And that too becomes a type. And there's some quite curious ones too, if you hunt around. But this is really trying to make meaningful the biblical text. You need to, and this is how the ancient writers, both Greek and Latin, and as well as Syriac, the biblical text was meaningful. Being inspired, it conveyed meaning. Now, that meaning was not univalent. There's no one interpretation. It's polyvalent or multivalent. I don't know which is the best term.
Right.
Many possible interpretations. And so it's really what is meaningful and helpful in a particular context that makes a particular interpretation sort of worthwhile, valid. Perhaps valid isn't a very good term. So you can have many different interpretations of the same passage, and some of them may seem good at one time, and then at another time totally flat. But they're sort of latent possibilities, and they're pointers. And Christ is sometimes described as the key to the understanding of the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament. So he's the interpretational key, the hermeneutic key. So everything becomes meaningful if you use Christ as the focal point.
Incredible. What incredible insight, Dr. Brock. I'm so blessed and so grateful to have you here with us. You brought up what I find to be a very, very incredible kind of interpretation. You pointed out how in the Syriac tradition, they also interpret that passage in Ezekiel to be talking about the closed gate that only the Savior would pass through. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Is that, and I know you've said many times that Ephrem, at least, doesn't like to get into dogmatic type of language, but when they use that imagery of that closed gate, is that an allusion or a direct reference to the fact that they believed Mary only had Christ as a child?
Certainly that would be the general belief in antiquity, wherever.
Wonderful. Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I do want to see if Daniel and Elijah have any other questions for you before we get to the audience questions. But I do want to ask you one other thing that I've got on my mind, and I hope I don't rob the question from Daniel or Elijah, but do any of the Syriac fathers, and I know people might be thinking, you guys are just talking about Jacob, you're just talking about Ephrem. I'd like to widen it to any of them, really. Do any of them grab upon that imagery of Mary as the new ark?
Oh, yes. I will find that very frequently in liturgical poetry. In fact, the place I can tell you exactly where it is. It's at the end of the morning office for Wednesday in the Syrian Orthodox tradition. And there's a rather striking poem where she's the ark, or which is the ark typifies her.
Beautiful, Dr. Brock. I do want to pass it over to Daniel, and then we'll get to Elijah, and then maybe we can get to some chat questions. I know people are really interested in asking you some things, but Daniel, do you have anything to ask Dr. Brock?
Yes, Doctor. I have another question regarding the robe of glory. So
yes.
In the case that, in the parallels that we see in the poetry for Ephrem about Mary and Eve, so in the case where Eve already had the robe of glory and then lost it, and Mary being the new Eve, but she acquired the robe of glory later in her life. Does that give us any implication? But does that tell us anything in terms of does it imply an increase in holiness only, or does it also imply a possible lack of holiness before she received the robe? What can we make of that parallel and the poetry regarding the robe in that context?
That's an interesting question. I guess it's a new relationship to her son when she's baptized by his presence in her womb, but it gives her a new relationship to God the Word and God the Father, and so that is certainly added on. And there are probably other things if one sort of thinks a bit longer than I've got to immediately. So you see, the robe of glory has eschatological aspects. And in the Ephrem's hymns on the paradise, at one point he says, he thinks of paradise as a mountain, rather like Dante, and this is an old Mesopotamian tradition found in the Book of Enoch too, hinted at in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, but it's not very prominent. And so the Adam and Eve are created as we're halfway up, then they get chucked out, so they're on the foothills. But Ephrem says at the eschaton, everything will move up one level, as it were. And of course, at the top is the divine presence, the Shekhinah. So it's moving up to the top. So it's an ascent, an eschatological ascent. Does that make sense?
Yes, Madfona. Thank you very much.
Elijah, did you have anything you wanted to ask Dr. Brock about before we we'll go to some audience questions in a bit, but I know you'd love to pick his brain a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, William. So my question, going back to the Annunciation, where the Syriac fathers like Saint Jacob and Saint Ephrem, where they talk about a purification, and I know Saint Ephrem talks about purification of the mind, and a purification where there's an understanding, or I know Sub-Deacon Daniel has the text, but what does Ephrem mean by the purification of the mind? What does he mean in general by the purification? What was she lacking before that she now has? Is it just her being just made more holy where she wasn't holy, and she was just being made more holy? What does he mean by that?
Well, exactly. I can't answer really, but what I suspect Ephrem has in mind is that the purification is the purification of, as it were, her intellect, her understanding of her relationship to God, and that, of course, is a matter of the revelation to her through the Annunciation. So it's not so much a moral thing, and it's quite interesting that Ephrem and other Syriac writers use the word for pure very often alongside another word which can also be translated pure but has a different set of connotations. It's the word that's used of a road that's clear of stones, and this is you'll find it's used like that in the Syriac Old Testament, and so it's not necessarily moral purity, though that is often present, but it's also a sense of clarity of understanding. In the book, I tried to write about Ephrem's approach to, human life, which I entitled The Luminous Eye. It's what the term I translated luminous, that can also be translated as pure, as lucid, as clear. So it would be a term that's used of a liquid which had, let's say, dust in it when stirred, but it becomes shafia, that's the Syriac term, when the dust has settled. So that's the sort of thing that's, as it were, clearing out the clutter. So I'm not my mind had a lot of clutter in it, I'm sure, but that's it's clarity. Maybe it's the focusing in this case. So I guess probably Ephrem's using purity, the adjectives of pure and purity, the noun, in that sort of way. But of course, it's very difficult to tell, and without the precise context. Ephrem is not an easy writer to understand, and one needs to think very carefully about each passage before, as it were, dictating what he's trying to say. And
Right.
quite often I go back to something I think I've or have translated, and then I find, I completely misunderstood that. Very embarrassing, but that does happen.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I do have one last question, sort of sticking to the same topic, but moving to Saint Jacob, where he talks about, and I'll quote him real quick here, if you don't mind. He says, "Indeed, the Holy Spirit came to
Sorry,
Mary."
the line seems to be very difficult at the moment. Can you hear me?
You had a little bit of feedback there, Elijah. There we go. We hear you great now.
Okay. Jacob says here, he says, "Indeed, the Holy Spirit came to Mary to let loose from her the former sentence of Eve and Adam. He sanctified her, purified her. He freed her from that curse of suffering on account of Eve." What does he mean by that? Does that mean from that point on, Mary ceased from suffering? Does that mean that she became like the Eve of old from that point on? What does that mean exactly at that passage?
Well, one needs to remember that Mary is used in Syriac Fathers as a paradigm for the ideal, the state of a human person. And so you need to, probably in that passage, you need to think of Mary as the paradigm of what should be, would ideally be the case of each individual Christian. And often if you do take that sort of move from the individual to the collective, then you can understand a passage in a rather different, sometimes much more meaningful way. So it might be worth thinking of that.
Thank you. That was beautiful. That's you know, your answers are basically what Daniel and I and William, we've suspected these answers to be the case, and then you're just confirming what
Yes.
we said. You know, so that's
That's lucky.
Definitely. Dr. Brock, thank you so much. I do want to get to some audience questions because people will probably throw tomatoes at us if we don't get to a few of them. People are really, really happy to have you here. I do see one question. Somebody is asking, does Dr. Brock have any thoughts about how Ephrem's teaching and liturgical works on Marian devotion sit among other Syriac fathers? I guess he's kind of asking, does Ephrem take a place of, I guess, preeminence? That's kind of what I get from that question.
Well, I think he certainly has a place of preeminence. He's highly regarded by all the later Syriac tradition. They're sometimes a bit worried. Philoxenus around about 500, he's in the middle of the Christological controversies, and he finds Ephrem, Ephrem's not terribly helpful from his point of view because of his dislike of doctrinal statements. But apart from that, Ephrem is held in very great veneration, and in fact, Ephrem's best expositor is Jacob of Syriac, and often you have just a hint in a poem of Ephrem, and that's drawn out by Jacob in a much more leisurely way. So if one's got a problem in Ephrem, go and look in Jacob, and he may solve it.
Incredible, incredible. I do want to, I'll ask you another question, and then we do have our host extraordinaire, Michael, who just showed up right now. I'll toss a few questions his way after I ask this one to you. He's a big fan of your work as well. He's actually the main host of the show. I was filling in for him because he was in another show. But I do want to ask you one question, Dr. Brock. I've greatly appreciated your presence with us today. Somebody is asking a question. I don't know if it has any relevance, but you can tell us if it does. He was asking, how is kekaritomene treated before Jerome's translation? He's talking about Luke 1:28, the Greek full of grace. I guess he's wondering, does Ephrem deal with that in an exegetical fashion?
I'm sure he does. This would be in the commentary on the Diatessaron, the harmony of the Gospels. What exactly he says, I have no idea. And the Syriac translation, the standard Syriac translation, is full of grace.
Yes. Oh, it is. Okay.
So in fact, it's very much what one would expect.
So it is in line with the classical interpretation, the classical translation. Then I was not aware of that.
Yes. No. It's very similar.
Excellent. I do know that Michael does want to ask you a few questions. It's particularly one on Augustine, and I do want to hear the answer. So I'm gonna toss the mic on over to Michael.
Michael, we can't hear you.
Yeah, Michael, I think you have your mic on mute. Yeah, Michael. There we go. Gotcha.
Hello. Yeah, I just had to adjust the setting there. Sorry, Dr. Brock, that I'm just now joining the stream. We had another stream going on, so I apologize for the overlap. But Dr. Brock, I'm kind of curious, and I'm sorry if you've maybe addressed this already, but could you maybe speak to St. Augustine and his role in the Syriac tradition? Is that something you would be able to comment on?
Unfortunately, I can't say anything about it because nothing of Augustine got into Syriac. And in fact, I think it's probably only from the 18th century onwards that he would appear anywhere in that tradition through Western missionaries. That's a surprising thing, but that is the case.
Okay, I see. Now, my other question was, sometimes when we look at Ephrem, somebody says that this is just kind of poetry, this is poetic language, it doesn't really pertain to doctrine. If you've already addressed that, I apologize, you could pass on it, but would you say that there's merit to that critique, or would you say that even though there's poetry going on here, it still pertains to theology and doctrine?
Well, I think you can have good religious poetry, and Ephrem is certainly a good religious poet, but you can also have poetry as theology, and I think that is true of Ephrem. And this is because if you read a lot of Ephrem, you find that there is a sort of presupposed substructure to his thought, how he understands the relationship between this world, the next world, and past and present, spiritual world, material world, and so on. And it's clearly a very well thought out system where one of the key terms is a term which literally means mystery, sometimes as best symbol, in a very strong sense, a symbol which is ontologically linked to what it symbolizes, and the sort of way that the Church Fathers normally understand symbol. But Ephrem has a very elaborate understanding of how these work, sort of vertically between this world and the heavenly world, horizontally between the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then the life of the Church. So it's very complex, and of course Ephrem never ever sets out his wares all at once. So you have to sort of grasp these through reading a lot of his poems, and then of course once you realize what's happening, things become much clearer. So I think Ephrem is genuinely a theologian as well as a poet.
Now, could you maybe speak to perhaps a shift in Syriac Mariology through the centuries? Have there been any shifts in the perspectives on Mary in the Syriac tradition, or have they been pretty unanimous?
I suppose fairly unanimous. The main shift is the greater growing influence of Greek. More and more Greek texts were translated into Syriac from the 5th, 6th, 7th century, especially, and that, of course, brings different perspectives on Mary. I don't think one can otherwise speak of any real change. And you haven't got the sort of thing, you haven't got the scholastic movement, you haven't got the Enlightenment, at least there is scholasticism, but it doesn't concern Mary at all, really. But there's no equivalent of the Enlightenment in the Syriac tradition until really modern times. And I suppose all the Oriental churches are undergoing the encounter with the results of the Enlightenment in the West. And that's, of course, quite a traumatic encounter, but also time will tell what it produces.
Now, could let me ask this: are there any texts in the Syriac tradition that you would say are timely for our era right now, but have not been translated into English or other languages that you would say are things that we should really know about?
That's actually quite a difficult. There's quite a lot that's available in English. There's a lot of Jacob now, thanks to an Indian scholar who translated a lot of the hymns on Mary. There's a huge amount that's untranslated and indeed unpublished. And the liturgical texts and anonymous poetry, there's a great deal there. Now, depends what one's looking for. Personally, I find some of this poetry is so beautiful. It's for me, it's sort of timeless. So whether it's going to speak to other people is another matter. I think it's when I do translations, I'm always hopeful that people will read them. Yeah. So it's not for me to say whether they're going to be useful or relevant. Sure. I think individuals may or may not find them valuable.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Dr. Brock. Those are all the questions that I have for the moment. I'll pass it back to William.
Great.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Brock. All of your answers have been they've been incredible. They've been just amazing. We greatly appreciate it. I'm looking in the chat. Maybe we'll take 2 more, and then I'll let you get to doing what you're doing. Don't want to take up the rest of your afternoon. We've greatly appreciated having you here. I do see one person asking, can you ask Dr. Brock about his thoughts on the discussions involving Justinian and the non-Chalcedonians?
Well, I suspect the question is connected to one particular aspect. Justinian was a very wily but very knowledgeable theologian, and at one point he organized the conversations between bishops supporting the Council of Chalcedon, that's of course his position, and Syrian Orthodox, or so-called Miaphysite bishops, on the opposition to Chalcedon. And quite remarkably, we have accounts of that meeting in 532 probably, from both sides, one in Latin from the Chalcedonian side, Justinian side, and one in Syriac. So you've got a fascinating case where you can see how the same dialogue, discourse, is reported by 2 different opposing parties. And of course, what happens, and it's what no doubt happens all the time in modern similar equivalent discussions, they each pass over embarrassing things and emphasize things where they think they've made a good point. But what is, I think, very important to remember there, and the talks failed and didn't have any success, but the key to why they failed is to be found in the Latin account, which says that at the end of the, was it at the end? No, at the beginning of the discussions, Justinian went into his private chapel and prayed that God would, as it were, force the other side to, not so much as to make fools of themselves, but to be won over by the arguments of his own side. I forget exactly how it's put, but it's in a way that is, as it were, preempting God's action. And it's that sort of overweening idea behind the whole project that I think led to its failure. And I think what I would have thought was necessary in that sort of case is an openness on each side to the possibility that, well, the other side was right, or at least the other side had a good point. And so often in these things, it's not a question of either or, but both and. And that is, in fact, the case with this particular controversy over Chalcedon. And in modern theological dialogue between the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian churches, this has been overcome very quickly, almost at the first or second session of the dialogue, that it's realized that each side was trying to say the same thing, but in different terms, and as it were from a different perspective, and so, or different tradition of understanding of technical terms. And that, in my view, is exactly what did happen. And it's this realization in ecumenical dialogue is a wonderful step forward. Unfortunately, it hasn't been sort of taken up officially by churches on either side. But it's there in the documents. And,
incredible, amazing.
I think this is something that needs to be, as it were, taken into account.
Amazing insight there, Dr. Brock. I do want to ask you one final question before we draw the curtains, before we close up. And it is one that comes from Elijah. He's wondering, actually we have two more. Elijah's asking, can you tell us if within the Syriac tradition, whether or not there is a theology on the death of Mary? Do they talk about whether she died to drink her son's cup? Or what exactly do they say about the death of Mary, if anything at all?
They say a great deal. In fact, a lot of the traditions of the Dormition of Mary, that's the term that's used in, well, both Greek and in Syriac, some of these traditions seem to have arisen in Syria in the probably late 5th century, and we have a large number of manuscripts and palimpsests on this topic. There's no one tradition. In fact, basically the Syriac traditions, or the main Syriac tradition, is very similar to the Greek one, and they're certainly interrelated somehow, but it's a very complex tradition, and there's a huge number of very early Syriac texts. And what is intriguing is some of the very earliest agree with things in Ethiopic, which is, as it were, on the fringe of the Christian world at the time, and also sometimes with Old Irish. So these are things that, as it were once fairly central, and then, as it were, survive only on the periphery. But the main tradition about the traditions that you find in the Greek church about the chemesis, the falling asleep of Mary, you'll find in Syriac tradition. It's the details that vary, where exactly it took place and so on. These were traditions that were very widely known, evidently. Given that we've got so many 6th century manuscripts, that's quite extraordinary. And also, I remember I was lucky enough to go to Georgia many years ago, and we visited various medieval churches, and the chemesis legends are all depicted on the wall paintings, medieval wall paintings, with the apostles sitting on clouds and traveling from their various locations to the dying Virgin Mary. The wonderful picture. So these are things that should be understood as a sort of a paradigm for what might happen.
Incredible. Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Brock. I'm going to pass it over to Daniel, who does have one final question for you. And I know it'll always be interesting. Daniel has very great insight.
Thanks, William. Manfono, I have a question about the topic that was recently asked. About the subject that was just asked you a question ago regarding, since they mentioned it, the Chalcedonian controversy. I read your work on the conversations of the 530s, the translation that you did. What do you think prevented these conversations from becoming fruitful? Was it the Synod of 536, or was it before that?
I think it was, as it were, politics. The Justinian's side, as it were, made a lot of concessions, and some of these would have been perfectly acceptable. But the one thing that they didn't yield on, and this is a purely practical question, it's nothing to do with theology, is that the banished bishops would not be allowed to return to their sees. So even if they agreed, they'd still be banished.
Such as St. Severus.
This sort of practice, so often, what happens in ecumenical dialogue today, too, is that there's some other issue which is non-theological. In modern dialects, it's often ecclesiological, that is brought up and, as it were, prevents advancement on what has been achieved. So I think it's this the attitude of Justinian, which was in many ways very conceding, and what he was offering was perfectly reasonable. But then the one practical thing, as it were, their employment, that's denied them.
I see. Saudi, my friend.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Brock. Thank you very much for your time. We greatly appreciate you putting aside some time for us. We know that you're very, very busy, and I do look forward to being in touch with you, my friend. Who knows, maybe later on down the line, we can have you back on. But I would love, before we wrap up, if you want to talk about anything that you're working on, a new book, a website, anything that you have that you want to debut or talk about, please put in a plug for anything, Dr. Brock, anything at all.
I have the bad habit of working on too many things at once, and it's partly that sort of time considerations or deadlines force this upon me. But the one thing that I was doing yesterday, I had an appeal from an Indian friend who was putting together a Sestrit volume in honor of someone, and he wanted an article from me. And so I was thinking, what should I do? And it was needed quite quickly. So I thought, and then I realized I had all the material for at least a preliminary edition of a very delightful poem, which is a dialogue between Job and his wife. These dialogue poems are very popular in Syriac, and I published a large number of them. There are quite a number on Mary and the angel, Mary and Jacob, Mary and the Magi, and so on. And this one on Job and his wife, I'd spent a long time trying to find the complete text. Eventually I did, because all the manuscripts had just half the text. And eventually I was able to piece it together, so the whole thing. And so I was working, that's what I was working on 24 hours ago, trying to put together, find this in a final form for my friend in India.
Amazing. Dr. Brock, do you by any chance have another book coming out anytime soon? Will you be working on another book, do you believe?
Something has just appeared, actually. It's called The People and the Peoples. So it's, and it's 4 dialogue poems on the theme church synagogue. And that's just been published very beautifully, because it's got lovely illustrations, and not any thanks to me, but thanks to the managing editor. And that's come out as a supplement to the Journal of Jewish Studies. And one of these poems is actually quite remarkable. Usually in Syriac literature, as I'm sorry to say, is the case in all too much early Christian literature, it's very hostile to Judaism. And Ephrem, too, himself is sadly hostile. But Ephrem actually uses a lot of Jewish material. But there's one of these poems, the first of these poems, Between the Church and the Synagogue, is very fair-minded. They each put forward very good arguments, and you're not provided with a judgment at the end, and that is truly exceptional. So it's a poem that I've been very interested in for a long time, and I'm glad that it's at last come out. So that's just come out. So the next thing, I think, will be a very technical thing, which won't be of any interest to your readers. It's a bibliographical survey.
Well, we do have a lot of people that do love very technical stuff, Doctor. So Dr. Brock, I will recommend that everybody go look for anything that you have that maybe will be coming out. And if you do have another book later on down the line that you have coming out on any particular issue, we will bring you back on and we will talk about it, and you can even plug the book. Thank you very much for being on, Dr. Brock, and I look forward to talking to you much more in the future.
Well, thank you very much, William.
Thank you, Doctor.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and share this material on your social media. And that'll be for all for now. We actually have another stream coming up in an hour and a half, so stay tuned for that. We're going to be having a theological roundtable discussion on the topic of original sin, I believe. Is that right, guys? Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have multiple shows coming up, so making sure I don't have that one mixed up. But yes, a roundtable discussion on original sin at 12 p.m. Central Time, so in an hour and a half. So y'all stay tuned for that. But again, please comment, like, subscribe, share this on your social media. Until next time, God bless you all.